Hello, thanks everybody for joining this. This is a 20 and 20 podcast. We have our interview with super agent David Falk. So we're just going to go ahead and get right into that. Okay, so we're pleased to be joined right now by a titan of his industry, Mr. David Falk. How are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. Delighted to be with you guys.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, you know what, David, I'm glad I was looking at the list of different people, and this is our second week starting on our podcast, and we have a lot of good people lined up, but I thought about you because at one point you were listed and you were noted as the most powerful guy in sports. Now, as being that, David, now to get out of it, do you miss being that most powerful guy in sports?
Well, number one, I was actually voted the second most powerful person in basketball, not in all sports. I don't know how you rate those things, but I think like a great athlete, everyone has a run. I had an amazing run between 1982 and 1986, just that 5-year period, Kermit. I was privileged to represent James Worthy, Michael Jordan, Patrick Ewing, John Thompson, Coach K, Johnny Dawkins, Chris Dolman in football, the 5th all-time sacker, Boomer Esiason. And if I just stopped at that point, I probably would have been the most successful agent ever. And the honor of representing all those Hall of Fame guys. When I was very, very young, I was in my early 30s. I worked 125 hours a week. It was a very unique opportunity. And so, as I closing in on 50 years in this business, I've had a chance to work for the best and the brightest. I think the game has changed. I think the players have changed. They're way more spoiled. I think they come into the league way too early. I don't believe in guys coming out of high school straight into the NBA. But I've been powerless to stop it. I've tried to urge people not to do that. But I'll never look back with any regrets. I've had an amazing career. I did the one job that I always aspired to do. And I have amazing relationships with people like you that I've known since, 1974. It's a long time, almost 50 years. And I've had lifelong friendships that will make the players sort of part of my family.
Well, tell me this, let everybody know how you got started in this business, because people know who you are now, but a lot of people say, well, how did he get into this business? How did he start? Where did he start?
So it's actually sort of almost like a comical story, but I went to Syracuse University, and the very first day of school, on my dorm floor had the 2-star basketball recruits, Greg Coles and Paul Petrowski, and we became best friends from day one. We're still good friends today. And I had this very romantic notion that we were all seniors and they got drafted, that I would be able to represent them. And sure enough, Greg did get drafted. He was the 6th leading scorer in the country. He was sort of like a John Paxson type, a Steve Kerr type, great shooter. And I realized when I was 21, what most agents don't realize today when they start, is I had no clue to what it was involved representing a player. So I decided to go to law school here in Washington, D.C. at GW. And I started meeting people. Probably at the middle of my second year of law school. I met a gentleman in Boston named Phil McLaughlin, who was a financial advisor representing a lot of the Celtics, including Red Auerbach. And he in turn introduced me to a gentleman who introduced me to Larry Fleischer, who, as you know, was the head of the Players Union back then. And as crazy as it sounds now with all these big companies like Wasserman and William Morris and CAA and Octagon, back then, most of the people who did it were sole practitioners. Fleischer had one secretary. He didn't have marketing people. He didn't have service people. I met Bob Wolf up in Boston, who I really liked, and nobody was really looking to hire anyone. And so I met I met Paul Tagliabue's boss, who was a guy named Hamilton Carruthers, who was the head attorney for the NFL. I met the head attorney for Major League Baseball. And all these people told me, David, if you want to get involved in sports as a lawyer, there's a guy in Washington, D.C. named Donald Dell who does tennis. And I'd never heard of Donald Dell. I really wasn't much of a tennis fan, but I decided I'd try to contact Donald Dell. And Kermit, you know Donald because you signed with him in 1973. Donald was virtually impossible to reach. I would call him for weeks on end. He was on vacation. He was at lunch. He was in a meeting with a client. He was in the men's room. I got every possible excuse you could get. And one day I woke up and I really had hit my limit, and I realized that I was a nothing, but the guy, as a courtesy, could at least pick up the phone once and say, hey, thanks a million, on hiring. So I went to the law library back then, which I never had gone to, with a roll of quarters. The payphones cost 25 cents back then. And I called him every 10 minutes. I called him 17 times, whatever, 4 hours, And finally, after the secretary ran out of all excuses, she put him on the phone. And he gave me an interview at his office on 17th and I Streets in Washington. So I was working at a law firm called Sidley and Austin part-time during school. And on my lunch hour, I walked over to 17th and I, and Donald kept me waiting 3.5 hours. And he finally let me back. And I'll never forget, he was sitting at his desk with one of those phones with 1 million buttons that light up. And Stan Smith, who's the #1 tennis player in the world, called him from London. And he was thinking of going on a skiing vacation. And Donald started screaming at him how crazy it was to go skiing. And I couldn't believe that anyone could be rude enough to talk to Stan, as your own client, the way he was talking to him. It was unbelievable. And so finally he gets off the phone. Now I'm on like 4.5 hours waiting for him. And I told him I wanted to work for him. And I told him my background. And he told me he was very, appreciative that I came, but they weren't hiring people with my credentials. That's what he told me. So, he had gone to Yale in Virginia, and Frank Quigley had gone to Carolina in Virginia, and Mike Cardozo had gone to Dartmouth in Virginia. And I was like, from the wrong side of the tracks. So I said to him, look, I really want to get into this business. I'll work for free. And so he hired me for free in the summer.
That sounds like Donald.
Oh, of course. Of course. And it didn't change very much, Kermit, over 17 years. But so I worked, after I finished at Sidley in Austin at 6 o'clock, I'd walk across the street and I worked for Donald for free all summer from like 6 p.m. to 11. And at the end of the summer, he said, look, you really worked hard. If you'd like, we'll give you a clerkship at the firm. We'll pay you $5 an hour. So it's my last year of law school. You're allowed to work 20 hours a week and be a full-time student. I averaged about 80 hours a week working for Donald. And I somehow got through school. I don't know how. And I waited and waited for him to give me an offer. And I had already graduated, still didn't have an offer. And finally, my friends would have burned his building down if he didn't give me an offer. They knew how hard I'd worked and how much I wanted it. And it turned out, I learned later on, that they actually try to hire, an Ivy League type guy from Princeton who was a tennis guy, but they didn't make him an offer till April. And he had already accepted a job in New Jersey. So he turned him down. And finally, they hired me. Donald took me to lunch. Kermit had no sense of time, zero. And so he said, let's have lunch tomorrow. I said, what time is this? 1 o'clock. So by 3:30, we still haven't left yet. I finished all my work. I'm literally waxing my desk. And he says, come on, let's go. I thought, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. So we go to this hamburger place around the corner called The Ranch. And Donald said, look, you worked really hard. We'd like to offer you a job as an associate. We'd like to start you with $13,000.
And what year was this? What year was this?
This was 1975. I graduated school, and I was about to take the bar. Now, there wasn't a secretary in the office who made less than $13,000, and most of my classmates, even the ones working for the government, were making like $18,000. So I told him, I said, Donald, I'm thrilled to get the offer, but I don't know if you're aware, because you're a small firm, but $13,000 is way below the market. And he was like astonished because he had no clue, what the world was like outside of the four walls of ProServe. And so he said, really? Well, our associates here at ProServe start at 13. Now I was the only one. So I told him, I said, okay, I'm going to accept it, but I'm going to prove to you that I'm worth more. And I worked there for 17 and a half years. I went from like a nothing to the vice chairman of the company. I was very successful. I had all his clients. And I told him over and over again that I would never ask him for a specific amount of money. He should pay me what he thought was fair. And I would never want to put a gun to his head and say, if you don't pay me X, I'll quit. I told him, but if I ever find out that anyone's making more than I am other than you, or if I ever wake up and feel I have to put a gun to your head, I'm going to quit. And that's what happened after 17 and a half years. I woke up one morning and he failed both tests. And I walked in on the day after New Year's and I resigned. And I was
Before you go any farther, what were you making at this point so people will understand what you're talking about?
I was making $220,000. Okay. Now, I turned down a friend of mine. I negotiated a deal for a friend of mine to buy an NBA team. He offered me a salary of $750,000.
And what year was this again?
88, 4 years before I went on my own. He offered me a signing bonus of $2 million, a 5-year contract for $750,000, and a 10% interest in the team, which sold 3 years ago for $2.2 billion. And now, if I'd worked for Donald for about 700 years, I would not have made that kind of money. And the funny thing, Carm, you know me well. The money didn't motivate me. I was doing something that I loved, working for people that were the best in the business. Now, obviously, I wanted to make more money, but I wasn't doing it for the money. And I turned down countless jobs in sports, making 4 or 5 times what he was paying me. And so when I finally resigned, he hadn't listened to me at all. He read my letter and he walks into my office and said, David, you can't resign. The firm will go under if you're not here. I'll give you a raise to $800,000. I said, well, Donald, if I'm worth $800,000, why am I only making $220,000? And he could offer me $8 million, Kermit. I knew it was time to go.
Okay, but before you go any farther, you were saying your mother was sick at this time. Is that correct, David?
Yeah, my mother had died. My mother died in 1988. She had been sick, and I really didn't have the money. Like later on, as you know, I was very fortunate. I made a lot of money when I sold my business and I brought my own jet. I would have loved to have been able to fly my mother up and back on a private plane. She had a feeding tube in her and oxygen. And it wasn't that I wanted to do anything, fancy with the money. I just wanted to have more security for my family. And so I was scared to death to go on my own because I had a non-compete with Donald and I wasn't allowed to be in the industry. But we spent a week and we negotiated a deal. And I sort of did what they call an LBO, a leverage buyout. I basically bought the business from him, and I had to pay him.
Why would he sell it? I don't know.
Because he had gotten so, Donald wanted to sign every single client in the firm. And he would write Donald personally, would underline personally 2 times, will manage your career. And everyone he signed with, who signed him with him, knew that once that letter, when the ink dried, you would never hear from him, maybe once a year. The basketball players called him the ghost. Like they knew this is a guy's going to come down. He's a very successful guy, and he's going to sign you. And then you're going to get put with this young bald guy, David Falk, who's like the basketball guy. And if you see Donald like once a year, he had no idea. And he didn't really need to. He was the head of the company. I mean, you can't run every aspect of a company. You have to have good people, working for you. And so I eventually took over basketball and football, which is what I loved. I wasn't much of a tennis person, and I grew it. It was the only, Kermit, basketball and football, which I called team sports, was the only division of ProServe that was profitable. Everything else was losing money. And
so
Donald
recognized that you were the key man in the whole operation. He even recognized that, obviously.
Well, he recognized it, but he didn't compensate me for it. And I honestly, I have no bitterness. He did me the biggest favor ever. Ironically, as time went by, I sold the business. He sold his business for a very modest amount. I think he got like 11 million. And we sold our business for 200 million. And eventually everything got merged up. He ended up working for me, Kermit, which was awkward. And I think he was afraid that I would treat him like he treated me. But and so he took me to breakfast 4 times to talk about it. And I finally said the 4th breakfast, said, Donald, look, he kept asking me if I was bitter about my experience at Pro Serve. And I finally told him, no, let's agree on two things. Number one, you really screwed me. You never paid me what I was worth. You paid other people under the table. You had all these secret deals, which is the way he's a very political guy. But had you offered me $1 million a year like Magic Johnson, I would have sold my life away and would have cost me hundreds of millions of dollars. So let's agree on two things. You screwed me and I'm not bitter. Now, can we please stop having these crazy breakfasts?
But it's one of those situations that I've seen a lot in just going through corporate America, where people are often punished for their loyalty.
Yeah. Well, David, like yesterday, we were talking last night. I said David was like running around, and I didn't mean the word gopher.
No, I didn't. I was the lowest man on the totem pole.
You would run around like a nervous wreck. Now, tell me who was the nervous wreck that ran around with you? Remember, we were in Mexico. He was working with you.
Bill Pollock.
Oh my God, he was gonna have a nervous breakdown all the
time. I know. But listen, I there was nothing. I was starting out in a business with these very successful people, and there was nothing that was beneath me. I wanted to learn, and I did learn, and I give Don a lot of appreciation and credit, for hiring me, even though he hired me reluctantly because the guy at Princeton turned him down. He gave me my start in a business doing something that I love. And I would say, Kermit, that when I watched Donald in action, I respected what he had accomplished, but his style was totally inimical to the way I wanted to be. Donald never spent a lot of time preparing. He was thought he was good on his feet and he could wing it. I'm a nut for preparation. I study the numbers, I study the comparables, I study the history, I study the economics. I want to go into that negotiation as the most prepared guy in the room. So in many ways, Donald was like a negative role model for me. I wanted to be totally different than the way he was. And particularly when I ran my own company, I didn't want to be cheap. I wanted to overpay the people. I want them to feel that they were being supported. And I didn't want to micromanage the business. I had a partner who was like the COO. He ran the business and I didn't interfere. I didn't tell him whether paper clips should be silver or bronze or where the secretary should be sitting or what they should get as a raise. Donald micromanaged everything and he ran the business into the ground. That's why I had to sell it for $11 million. If he would have kept all the people together, Frank Craighill, Lee Fedris, Mike Cardozo, the company would have been worth $500 million, at least, maybe more. And so, I learned a lot from watching. I learned a lot of good things, and I learned a lot of things that I wanted to change when I was on my own. And I'm not claiming that I was a perfect boss or I didn't make mistakes, but I didn't want to be the way Donald was.
Well, something, when you said Mike Cardozo changed my life because he's the one that said, Kermit, you need to go to Pete Newell and you need to start working with him. He says, the coaches you have are good guys, but they were point guards. And he says, a point guard can't help you at all get off that bench. For the first 2.5 years, I'm on that bench and I'm trying to get off. He says, go to Pete Newell and make him work with you. So I would go up and sit in Pete Newell's office after practice every day, and I would want to talk to him. And Mary Lou was the secretary up there with the Lakers, and I would sit there, and he says, well, she always kept saying, well, Pete Newell can't see you right now. So I would be so disappointed because I had read, and Mike Cardozo had told me about how good he was as a coach at Cal Berkeley and Olympic teams and Michigan State. So because of Mike Cardozo, I stayed on him. And he told me, he said, first of all, I can't work with you, Kermit, because it'll be embarrassing to the coaches.
Wow.
He said, but then the third year, he retired. And he says, now, Kermit, I'll start working with you. And that's getting me off the bench. I mean, I was on that bench because I didn't really know how to play the forward position. And people don't realize that basketball is like football. There's a difference between a fullback and a halfback, but the average person doesn't know the techniques or the fundamentals that are different. So because of Mike Cardozo, Pete Mills started working with me, I became a starter right after that. And it's just like what you're saying. You need to be around the right people who have the right information and are willing to help you. And that changed my life because of Mike Cardozo and what he made me do. Because I didn't know anything about Pete Mills' coaching history. But Mike Cardozo said that. And first of all, why did Mike Cardozo and all of you guys broke up? They all broke up together?
No. So Michael Cardozo is my neighbor, Kermit. He lives less than 2 blocks from here. I see him from time to time. He lives right next to James Brown. He lives across the street from Roy Hibbert, who's my neighbor. And Michael taught me the business. Michael, day to day, Donald wasn't around very much. He taught me how to write contracts. He was my mentor, and I love the guy. He's an amazingly warm, generous person with his time. So Mike was chosen when Jimmy Carter ran for president in 1976. Mike ran the state of Connecticut for Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter won the entire East Coast except for one state, Connecticut. And to reward Mike for his great advanced work, Jimmy hired him as one of the 4 counsels to the president. So Mike left the firm for about a year. And that's when Donald came to me and said, look, David, we've got like 15 or 20 clients that Michael's working with. You, Roger Brown, Bud Stallworth, a bunch of tennis players. You need to step in. And I was 25 years old. I just started and I was just learning the business. And I hadn't met most of these people. You and I met the first time in Mexico, ironically. And
yes, I remember that.
Yeah.
Was Carlos Jones with you guys yet?
Exactly, Carlos Jones. So when Mike came back, and this should have been prophetic for me, but I wasn't old enough or wise enough to understand it. So when Mike finished his job with Jimmy Carter, he wanted to come back to ProServe. But he was as old as Donald. Michael's 80. I don't know if you know that, Kermit. Mike's 80. He got in the Navy before he came to ProServe, and he wanted to be a partner, and he deserved to be a partner. He had paid his dues, but Donald wouldn't make him a partner, so he never came back.
Oh.
And Donald did a terrible job of managing an amazing group of talented people, and sometime in groups. So in 1983, his 3 oldest partners, Frank Crago, Lee Fentress, and W. Dean Smith, who managed the money, who died last year, they left to form this company, which is now called Octagon, which is very successful. Steve Diston and Alan First, the marketing guy and the financial guy, left to form their own company. I was the last one to leave in 1992. And every single person that left that company, Kermit, has been incredibly successful on their own. And Donald was like a head coach who had a bunch of all-stars, and he just didn't know how to play them together. He didn't know how to treat them. He didn't know how to pay them. He didn't know how to keep them on the team. And he let them all go. It was a little bit like Donald Sterling, another Donald that you know well from the Clippers. Yes, never kept his great players with George Shinn and Charlotte. And I don't say that with any animosity to Donald, but I watched that and I realized, when you have your own company, you have to protect your key people. You can't let them leave. No one ever left my company from the time we started in 92 till the day we sold it. And I learned that from Donald, how important it is, your people, your only asset. And so it was a great training ground for me. And as I say, I don't want these comments that I'm making. I have no animosity to Donald. I'm grateful that he gave me a start. I feel sorry for Donald, Kermit, more than anything.
Well, tell me this, why did you sell your company? And how much, did you think it was worth, and why did all that come up?
Okay, so I went on my own, and I got to admit, it was like a kick for me every day to walk in the door. It said Falk Associates Management Enterprises. Okay. We called it FAME. And I loved seeing my name on the door, I did. And I had no desire to sell the company. And more interestingly, Kermit, it never occurred to me that you could sell a business that's a personal service business. It never occurred to me anybody would want to buy it. And we weren't looking to sell it, but about 1997, people started calling us and saying, hey, you guys have an amazing business. We'd like to buy it. One of the companies is American Express. One of the people is one of the Walmart heirs, a female Walmart in Arkansas, who loved basketball, ended up starting an agency. And then I got a call from this guy who I knew named Bob Gutkowski, who'd been the president of Madison Square Garden. And he had left the Garden to start what they call a roll-up, where you take a bunch of small companies and you put them together. And the roll-up was called Marquee. And they bought ProServe in 1997 for $11 million. And Bob came to see me and said, David, we'd love to buy your company. And when I went home and told my wife, she said, look, you've been complaining about Donald for years. If you're dumb enough to go back into business with him, I never want to hear another complaint. And as usual, she was right, and my wife, Rhonda. And so we went back and told the person who Bob worked for, his name was Bob Sillerman. And we said, Bob, your company is SFX. You own Marquee. If you want to buy us, we're not ProServe. We're not some of these C-level small agencies. We are the crown jewel in this business. If you want to buy us, you have to buy us through the parent.
Okay, before you go any farther, what players did you have at this time?
We had them all. So this is 1998. So we had Michael, Patrick, Alonzo, Mutombo, Allen Iverson, Antoine Walker, Keith Van Horn, Kerry Kittles, Boomer Esiason, Chris Dolman, James Lofton. We had 40 superstar players.
Yeah.
You were at the peak at that point.
Yeah. And, we were averaging 3 or 4 number 1 picks every year. As I said, we weren't looking to sell it. So we hired Goldman Sachs, Kermit, to be a financial advisor. And they told us that the company was worth somewhere between like 75 and 80 million. And I told my partner, I'm not going to sell the company if it's only worth 75 or 80. And he said, why not? That's a lot of money. It has nothing to do with the money. I really don't want to sell it at all. And more importantly, I don't want to have to work for someone, because my relationship with Donald was
Who
like,
was your partner? Who was your partner at this time?
his name was Curtis Polk. He was the
Oh,
financial,
yes, Curtis, yes.
Curtis was the financial guy in the firm, and he was great at running the firm. Curtis was a great partner for me because we had complementary skills. I brought in the business, I negotiated the contracts, and I did the marketing. And he negotiated. He managed the investments, and he ran the business day to day. And he was great at that. So, I said to him, I don't want to work. I don't want to have another possibility where my boss could become another Donald Dell. It was like an abusive relationship. And so I said, if I can't get 100 million, I'm not going to sell. And he thought that was ridiculous, but it had nothing to do with the money. And the 100 million was completely arbitrary. It was really like setting the bar very high, Kermit, because I really didn't want to sell. So one day, after about 3 or 4 months of negotiating our deal, Goldman Sachs, I got a call from Bob Sullivan, who's trying to buy it. And he called me up to New York and he said, look, David, we really want to buy your company. What do your people think it's worth? And I said, they think it's worth 75 to 80 million. He said, well, that's what we think. Why can't we make a deal? And I said, truthfully, Bob, I really don't want to sell it. And I've made up my mind that if I can't get 100 million, I'm not going to sell it. And if you don't think it's worth 100 million, you won't offend me at all. My people don't think it's worth 100 million. But he ended up trying to pay us 100 million, but the stock ran up so high, it ended up being, 200 million.
Now, when you say that, so other people understand, when you say the stock ran up to.
So we got a lot of money in cash. We got 1 million shares of stock, and the stock was priced at 17, and it went up to 91.
Oh, wow.
Now, the funny part of the story, Carmen, was we hired Goldman, and the head of Goldman Sachs is an incredible man named Hank Paulson, who later became the Secretary of the Treasury and bailed us out of the financial crisis in 2008. And I had met Paulson literally twice in my life. And first time I met him in Chicago, Michael had a small company doing some golf stuff, which was bought by AMF, and Goldman owned 25% of AMF. And Hank's from Chicago, and he's a big basketball fan, and he loved Michael, so he came to the closing. When Michael retired, I went to a game at the Garden. I had floor seats, and the Bulls were playing the Knicks. And with 3 seconds left in the game, the Bulls are up 2. I'm sitting right next to Paulson, just by a fluke, he and his wife. And Pippen fouls Larry Johnson with 3 seconds to go. And Hank was like a teenage fan. He goes, oh my God, David, this is terrible. He said, Larry Johnson's going to make both free throws. We're going to go to overtime without Pippen, and we're going to lose the game. Now, you know how guys are, Kerm, like when we're all together, we're all talking trash to each other. So just to try to be funny, I said, come on, Hank. I said, he's going to miss the first. He's going to make the second. We're going to win by one. And you and I are going to go out and have a drink. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. He thought that was like predicting the rate of inflation. he thought that was, and I was just fooling around. So anyway, so one day in the middle of this back and forth, negotiating the price of the company, I got a call at home on a Sunday from Hank Paulson. I almost fainted. And he said, David, I just learned that you've hired our company to negotiate the sale of Fame. Like, why didn't you call me and tell me? And I want to say, like, God, like, why would I call you? Like, we're like a pimple in your business. Like, you're buying and selling companies worth $500 million, $1 billion. And I said, no. He said, like, I love sports. I really respect you. He said, you should come to work for me. So he said, and I want to help you. And I was Kermit. It was a little bit like what you said to Donald when you signed him. I said, you want to help me? He said, yeah, I really do. And he did. And when he jumped in, it changed everything. When he got involved and it showed Bob Silverman that, we had the ability to have someone as well-known and competent and powerful as Hank Paulson, it got everyone more serious, and it accelerated the negotiations. And when the deal was over, I took Hank to lunch with his son, Merritt, who owns the soccer team in Portland, with the Timbers. And I just wanted to thank him. I was so appreciative that and this was very much like a role reversal for me, Kermit, because, in the business of agents and players, what's the number one complaint players make about their agent?
Not around enough, or
Correct. That's it. They're never around enough. So, like, I was like stupefied that a guy as busy as Hank Paulson, could find the time to get involved in this piddly little company like that we had, at 100 million to 200 million for him is like, not even on the radar. So I asked him like 6 or 7 times, what were you doing during the several months that we were negotiating the sale of the company? And he wouldn't tell me, not because he was trying to be humble. He didn't want to embarrass me and tell me, like, he was working on like Michael Jordan and I'm dealing with the 15th guy on the bench. So finally, I wouldn't take no for an answer. He finally got embarrassed. He said, if you really need to know, he said, I was working on 4 deals while we were negotiating your deal. We did Chrysler and Mercedes-Benz, Universal and Polygram, Southwest Bell and Ameritech, and one other huge one. Those 4 deals that Goldman negotiated totaled $1.7 trillion. And Goldman's fee on those 4 deals was more money than we made selling the company. So after that, when a player would say to me, like, are you too big for me? I said, let me tell you a story about why you want someone who's big and powerful, because it's not how much time you spend, it's how much impact you make. And Hank Paulson changed my life by the few hours that he spent, helping me. And I will always be grateful to him for that.
Do everything like you love me, and other things like a real G. I don't need nothing you do for me, it's all good, just love me. Do everything like you love me, and other things like a real G. I don't need nothing you do for me, it's all good, just love me.
Well, I tell you that, in a sense, when you got out, what happened to the players? Now, were they comfortable with the new ownership when you told, let's say, not Michael, but the other guys, I'm selling the business? What did they think?
So here's what happened. Because I had a non-compete, my lawyers told me the only way you could maintain any relationship after you leave is if you haven't talked to any of the clients. You cannot tell them you're leaving. You can't wink at them and tell them you're leaving. And I didn't. I followed their advice. And after Donald and I made the deal, at that point, I finally went to the players and said, look, I've decided to go on my own. I'm taking the entire staff with me, all the marketing people, the financial people, and no one blinked an eye, Kurt. We didn't lose one player. Nobody even, they barely knew Donald though. And so it didn't make any difference to them. I was their guy. They had, Curtis's staff to manage their money, and they had some really good people to do the marketing, and it was seamless. And I was worried that we would lose, 5 or 6 clients. I really expected that, but I was very, very rewarded with the loyalty that the client showed to me, particularly Michael. I mean, Michael could have anyone in the world represent him, and he signed with us. Del Crago, then he went to ProServe, then it became Fame, then it became SFX. He went through all the iterations. He finally said, don't you understand? I don't care what the name of your business is. All I care about is that you're going to take care of me and give me the best advice and do a good job. And Patrick the same way. I mean, those guys were amazing. John Thompson, Coach K, they were amazing. Every single one stayed.
Well, something, you had a good relationship with Georgetown and North Carolina. Tell us about the deal, and it's just a cute thing about Michael and Adidas and Nike. Can you talk about that deal?
It's funny. There's a movie coming out, Kermit, about how Michael signed with Nike. And I'm sure it's going to be a fun movie. A very good friend of mine, Jerry Cardinal, owns a big piece of Tom Cruise's production company, Skydance, who did the movie. And the essence of the movie is how Sonny Vaccaro convinced Michael to go with Nike. Now, the truth is that when the Olympics were over, I wanted Michael to sign with Nike, and Michael wanted to sign with Adidas. And our company, as you know, represented Adidas. They represented the owner of Adidas, Horst Dassler. And Michael said, look, I don't want to go with Converse, which I wore at Carolina. I've never heard of Nike. Just sign me with Adidas. So I said, Michael, this is like picking a college. You have to take visits to these companies and meet the people and see what they have in store for you. He said, David, I've had a grueling season in Carolina. I just spent weeks with Coach Knight, who ran us into the ground. Knight, I love Bobby Knight, but he's a demanding coach. And he said, I'm not going. Now, this is the very first thing I ever asked him to do after he signed with us. And he's turning me down. And I was really upset. So I called his mother and I said, Mrs. Jordan, if we're going to work together, Michael could pick any company he wants, but it's like picking a college. He has to take some visits, and I want to teach him how to pick the company. I don't want to just pick it for him. I don't want him to pick it in the abstract. I want him to understand what he's picking. And she says, David, don't worry. Michael will be on that plane. Now, in the meantime, Michael's tie to Nike was not Sonny Vaccaro. It was George Raveling, who's the assistant on the Olympic team, and they became very close. But neither George nor Sonny could even convince Michael to get on a plane and see Nike. Forget about going with him. They couldn't even get him to visit. I never talked once with Sonny ever about the deal. I made all the deals at Nike with Rob Strasser, who you know. And so we took.
But before people go, David, your personality, though, as an agent, wasn't an aggressive personality. And it's because it was at your beginning. I'm amazed that you got Michael. You get Michael to do something because you were just
I wasn't his mother. I got his mother to do it. I mean, he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. So we went out to see Nike Kern, and it was a classic. They created a music video. It was just the beginning of music videos to all his college and Olympic highlights. And they had the Pointer Sisters jump. They had Van Halen jump. The song "I'll Wear My." It was a great video. And Strasser was so nervous he couldn't get the machine to start, and he's sitting there like sweating. And George looking at him like he looked like he hated it. So then we finished that meeting, and the funny part was that Howard White from Maryland. So Howard,
good friend of mine.
Howard's a great guy, and Howard was the only African American
Yes.
executive in the meeting, and he showed up about 30 minutes late. So
You showed up late?
Strasser can't get the machine to work. Howard's late. And I'm thinking, God, he's going to fire me when this meeting is over. So we leave the first room, we go into the boardroom, and Strasser presents a line of clothes and shoes to Michael. And at the very end of the meeting, Phil Knight walks in, and he's sitting in the back. And just as the meeting's about to end, Strasser says, Michael, I know you like cars. And he reaches into his breast pocket of his suit to pull out, and Phil Knight is convinced he's going to pull out the keys to like a very expensive Mercedes. And Phil literally is clutching his heart, Kerm. And
I know Phil.
Strasser pulls out two little bottle cars, like 1-inch mini cars. And so anyway, we go to dinner. And at this point, Michael has not cracked a smile in 8 hours. I know he's mad at me. He's probably mad at his mom, for dragging him out here. He doesn't like it. And so at the end of dinner, as we're about to go back, I whispered in his ear, I hardly knew him. And I said, so Michael, what'd you think? And he goes, God, this is amazing. I don't want to go anywhere else. You could have blown me away, Kermit. I realized at that time that this young 20-year-old player is really smart, and he's an amazing poker player because he never, ever revealed an emotion during the meeting. He kept everything close to the vest, and he never went to another meeting.
Okay, well, what were they offering, David?
So I demanded of Strasser, I said, if you want to sign this guy, the two market leaders are Converse and Adidas. You have to treat him like he's a tennis player. You have to create a line for him of shoes and clothes as if you were Arthur Ashe or Stan Smith or Bjorn Borg or, Tiger Woods later on, Arnold Palmer. And so after that meeting, he came to Washington in August, and it was hot as hell. They had turned off the air conditioning in the building. It was the weekend. And Strasser looked like John Madden.
Was he an overweight man, if I remember right? Was he overweight?
Big. He was about 350 pounds with a big sort of reddish beard. And he said, okay, we may be willing to give you a line. What do you want to call it? Now, in the trade, when an athlete has his own shoes or clothes, it's either called a signature shoe or an autograph shoe because it has his name on it. So people will know that it's Kobe Bryant or Steph Curry or whomever. And so I said, are you kidding me? What do I want to call it? I want to call it Michael Jordan. What else do you call an autograph shoe? And he said, no, David, we are not going to call it Michael Jordan. I said, really? Why not? He said, 2 reasons. He said, first of all, no one's going to believe that a 21-year-old basketball player is going to be sitting in his apartment in Chicago designing shoes. It's got no credibility. And second of all, he said the designer craze in America where designers are slapping their names on everything from, sunglasses to beach chairs to cars, to run his course, it's over. So he said, so if you want to have a line, you have to come up with a name. And I wanted to get up and strangle him, Kermit, because in the trade, there's never been an athlete who has a line that's not known by his name, whether it's O.J. Simpson, Pelé, the greatest of all time. And I guess my anger gave me a rush of adrenaline, and it took me like 30 seconds, and I came up with it, AirJordan. I said, okay, I got a name for it. I don't want to say what I called Strasser. You have to bleep it out. I said, okay, blank, I've got a name for you. We're going to call it AirJordan. I said Air because he plays in the air, and Air because you've just developed this amazing new technology for your soles of your running shoes that cushions the athlete's foot. And the artist who was with him, Peter Moore, literally in 5 minutes sketched the first logo with the basketball and the wings, and we were off to the races. Now, the funny part was, so we signed the deal. Sonny doesn't even know how much the deal is for. When you see it in the movie, the numbers, he's not within $1 million a year of what Michael got, which I thought was very comical. And I have nothing against Sonny. I told the screenwriter for the movie, the sequel to your movie should be How the Russians Invented Baseball. Anyway, so they come out with the first shoe, and the day he wears it the first time, the NBA bans the shoe.
I know.
Because of the color. So Strasser calls up like a nervous wreck, and he says, God damn it, you made me sign this guy and the league banned his shoes. I said, God, that's great. He
That's
said,
the best thing that could happen. Yeah.
he said, why is it great? I said, we're going to do a Banned in Boston commercial. He said, what the hell does that mean? I said, you're going to come out with a commercial that says these shoes are so amazing that the NBA will let Michael wear them. And they did. They had that famous commercial where they panned down his body and, said on October 15th, whatever, the NBA, Nike came out with a revolutionary shoe and the NBA banned it. But fortunately, they can't ban you for wearing it. So the Air Jordan relationship is unquestionably the most successful corporate relationship any athlete has had in history with any company. It's approaching $6 billion, something I'm very proud of. I'm very proud that I was able to do that for Michael. He deserves it. I think he's the greatest player of all time. He's been a great client. He's been a great friend, incredibly loyal. And whatever he has, he's earned, Kermit. No one's given him anything. The guy's worked really hard.
So how is it when you think about it? Like, are you really surprised all these years later that there's still such a frenzy for the Air Jordan line?
Oh my goodness.
No, I think there are a number of reasons for that. The main one obviously is Michael's incredible popularity around the world. The second one is, and I hope Phil Knight listens to this, Kermit, because Phil is an incredibly successful man. And my job was to be the brand manager for Michael. I didn't work for Nike. I worked for Michael. And we didn't always agree on strategy. And obviously, he was never going to get mad at Michael, so he always got mad at me. But that's your job. And one of the things that I was frustrated about when the shoe really started to take off was that they weren't making more pairs. And Phil said to me, David, look, we're going to restrict the production to make this last a long time. And I bumped into Phil at a dinner honoring Coach K in New York about 5 years ago. And I went up to him and said, Phil, you got to call him at both ends. You were 100% right. You made the right decision by restricting the sales because it's what your owner in Portland, Kermit, Larry Weinberg, used to call a philosophy of scarcity. You make something scarce, people want it more. Now, for your listeners, I'll give you an incredible statistic. So when we were doing the contract, at the very last minute, Strauss turned to me and said, David, what happens after we give him this contract if he doesn't become as good as everyone says he's going to be? I said, well, what would you like to happen? And he said, well, we'll honor the contract for the full 5 years. We'll pay him every dollar he's owed. But if he doesn't make the Rookie of the Year as a rookie, or in the first 3 years, he doesn't average 20 points a game ever, doesn't ever make the All-Star team, we want to be able to stop making the shoe. We'll pay him money, but we want to stop having to make his own shoe. And I said, Rob, that makes no sense. You're not in the business. You're not an NBA team. What do you care what his statistics are? All you should care about is how many shoes he's selling. He said, yeah, you're right. He said, it's okay. So I said, I'll give you a number. If at the end of the third year, as we head into the fourth year, if we haven't sold $3 million worth of shoes, we want to
just 3 million,
which was huge. I mean, Nike was a tiny company. They probably didn't have 300 million in sales at the time. We want to be able to stop making the shoe. And I said, no problem. So the deal was that if he wasn't Rookie of the Year, which he was, and if he didn't make the All-Star team, which he made every year, and if he didn't average 20 points, they could terminate it unless they sold 3 million. Now, obviously, so in year one, just to give you a framework of what their expectations were, they thought selling 3 million would be like hitting a grand slam home run. And Michael sold 126 million the first year. He also
126 million?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
He sold roughly 40% probably of all of Nike shoes. And he became so synonymous with Nike that a lot of people call the company Mikey. And so it was, something, again, Michael earned it. His popularity drove the sales. I'm just proud that I had the foresight to understand that he could break the boundaries of every stereotype People didn't think that a black athlete could be popular on Madison Avenue, that he could sell shoes. And Michael, by his performance on the court and his personality off the court, broke every barrier known to man. Every young player today, from LeBron to Kobe, Russell Westbrook, that has their own shoe, really owes a debt of gratitude to Michael, because he created that opportunity for them. It didn't exist. Magic didn't have one. Bird didn't have one. No one. Kareem didn't have one.
But you know something, another thing about shoes, and Michael, to this day, people unfortunately will die trying to get those shoes. But all the other people that had the big guys, like I hate to say it, Patrick Ewing, nobody wanted a guy that wore a size 16 shoe. So I mean,
That's
I'm
true.
not saying.
No, that's
they
true. But
want-
Patrick, ironically, Kermit, Patrick wore a 13, same as Michael, and
13?
his shoes are still selling. He makes $1 million a year
No.
to this
Well,
day.
I'm not saying that, but
In
it's
comparison, you're saying?
yeah, in comparison, because guys want, because you don't look like Shaq shoes, they look like boats. So
Right.
people, they don't want to be putting on a boat. They want something very stylish. And now what they're doing, when they dress up for their formals, they'll wear Michael Jordan's,
Right.
what, 11s, or what was it? The
Yeah,
black
that
ones,
was- yeah,
the
that's-
patent leather ones.
Yep,
To
11.
this,
That's
to
my
this
favorite.
day, people, you have a pair of Jordans.
Oh, yeah.
It's incredible.
And-
Hey, Kerm, listen, you love this. I played golf about 4 years ago here in Washington with Tiger Woods. I had to pay $50,000 to play with him.
Who?
Tiger Woods.
Okay.
And to his charity. I had to pay 50, and he came up and introduced himself. He knew who I was. He knew I was Michael's guy. And for the first 5 holes, he didn't say a word. A word. Now, I didn't pay the money to walk with him. I paid money to talk to him. I wanted to get to know him a little bit. And
Did you tell him that?
so after the 5th hole, I'm wearing these really cool 11 Concord AirJordan golf shoes. And I turned to him, I said, Tiger, I bet you'd love to be able to wear cool shoes like this when you play golf. And that finally broke the ice.
That's good.
Well, as a big sneakerhead myself, I do want to personally thank you for all of the buttons that you pushed to make that happen, because that's something that actually I share with my nephew James, down near San Diego. I've helped him get his collection together too, because my son's not so much into it. My daughter's into it a little bit, but I have a big collection. He's got a big collection.
Now, I'll tell you something,
We love
Kermit.
it.
I'll be a little controversial here for your show, okay?
Okay.
I've never said this publicly. I've said this to people in the shoe industry. In my opinion, from 1980 to today, okay, 42 years, I think there's only 2 players that really sell shoes. Michael Jordan, and you tell me who the second one is.
Iverson.
Correct. I think the rest of them are great endorsers, but if you understood how Nike sells shoes, they have a futures program, and they say to like Foot Locker, oh, you want Jordans? You have to take, Westbrooks. You have to take LeBrons. You have to take whatever. I mean, Michael sells 6 billion. The next guy probably sells 500,000, 500 million. And it's not to say that they aren't great players or great endorsers, but I think that Nike is really selling the shoes, and they're putting together a great stable of star players to promote the Nike brand. But I don't think a lot of these, there are players who don't sell as many shoes in a year, in dollars, as they're being paid by the companies. Some of these guys are making $10, $15 million. I don't think they'll sell $5 million worth of shoes, but the company's deciding to keep them away from Nike for defensive purposes.
Okay. Well, the thing is that what Ira said, I liked his shoes too. They were nice, and a lot of guys, and because he was a smaller guy, the shoes looked nice. And I mean, and with Shaq, I knew Shaq well too, but Shaq.
Well, it wasn't just the shoes, Kerr, for Iverson. Alan, we represented Alan his first 2 years. I really like Alan. He's a really interesting man. And he is I think today, he's in his 50s. He's one of the most marketable athletes.
I know. And he doesn't carry himself well enough to sell them.
No, I think he does. I think people love Allen Iverson, and they take him for what he is. He's the first crossover guy between hip hop and sports, and he's an icon. And, you know, he did a gambling commercial last year. I don't know who's doing the stuff for him, but I think Iverson could be like Shaq. Shaq is one of the most marketable guys right now, despite the fact that he's big. And because he's big, he's like a big teddy bear. I love Shaq.
He is.
I love Shaq's personality. He's warm. He's funny. He's great. And
I can tell you stories about Shaq, and I don't know how much time you have, but we're in Hawaii with Pete Mills' Big Man's Camp, and I said, Shaq says, Kermit, I'm gonna rent a scooter and I'm gonna go around the island. I said, don't you get on no scooter. He calls me at 4:00 in the morning, David, and he's fallen off the scooter and he dragged him up the street. So they called David Stern and they sent a doctor from New York, Pete Mills, yelling at me because I let him get on a scooter. You don't tell Shaq what to do.
And this is pre-rookie Shaq, right?
No, he was second year.
Oh, he's already in the league.
Already in the league. And he would come to Pete Mills' camp, and he's probably like Michael. When he would come to the camp, and then in Hawaii, the big man's camp, you'd have, the place would be packed. I mean, everybody's there. And all the guys that came to the camp, they would say, well, here's the thing. Pete Mills says to me, Kermit, do you think you could get Shaq to come to the camp? I said, okay, let me try. I called Shaq's people and I said, well, Sports Illustrated wants to do a story on Shaq coming to Pete Mills' camp in Hawaii. Is he coming? Oh yeah, we're going to send him there. Then I would call Sports Illustrated. Shaq's coming to Pete Mills' Big Man's camp in Hawaii. Are you going to cover it? Oh yeah, we will cover it. We'll be right there. And so I had to do that for a lot of things. And Pete Mills never knew that because Pete Mills wanted to hope that he wanted to come and work out there. Shaq dominated everything. It was a joke how he would just dominate every player, and it was wonderful. But like Michael, I'm gonna tell you a story about Michael. Michael was he was just so far out. My son wanted to see Michael when he came to Portland. He was like in the 4th grade. So I take him out of school, and Portland is playing Chicago, and they're gonna have a shoot around. So I get my son. I said, Trey, we're gonna go see Michael Jordan. And see, Phil Jackson. I used to play against Phil Jackson. So he says, no, Kermit, you can come to the practice. So after practice, Michael comes over to Trey, my son, and Pippin comes over. And I said, Trey, say hello to Michael. My son couldn't open his mouth. He couldn't open his mouth. He just stared, eyes big. Michael took his jacket, signed his little thing, and Pippin did it. And he didn't say anything. Michael, people don't realize that Michael is bothered by everybody. But he's a nice guy. One time he says, Kermit, I want to talk to you for a second. I said, you want to talk to me? Because I went into the locker room. He said, no, Kermit, I want to talk to you for a second. I looked around and said, this Kermit, you want to talk to? Because I had put him up because I didn't play against them. And I had put him so far off of the thing. And I knew he knew who I was. I said, okay. I sat down there and he was getting taped and he just wanted to talk. I said, I was honored that he even wanted to talk to me. But, it's funny that, David, you're around all these great players and the personalities. And people don't know what kind of personality he was. One thing that bothered me, Michael Jordan doesn't help with charity. We don't know what he does. And he's smart not to let everybody know what he does because he'll never be not bugged to death. And you were around him and you know how much good he did for the communities and for other people. Do you want to have any stories about?
It's interesting. He had a public charity for a while, the Jordan Foundation, which his mother ran. Dolores was a really terrific woman. She works for the State Department. They have her go all around the world giving speeches, motivational speeches. And his sister, Rosalind. And they raised a ton of money for charities in Chicago. But the press wrote an article saying that his mother and his sister were being paid too high a salary, that the charity could have made more money. And he got so upset with that he decided to make his charity private because he didn't want his family to be criticized. I mean, one of the amazing things about the media sometimes is that when it comes to charity, they did the same thing here in Washington. They wrote an article in the Washington Post about the various athletes that were doing charities in Washington. One of them was our client, Juwan Howard. And the minute he started a foundation, we applied to the IRS for a tax ID number, and the IRS,
501c3. Yeah,
the IRS is very
501c3.
slow, and they hadn't given him one. So they wrote an article in the Washington Post saying that his charity wasn't legitimate. So I called up my friend George Solomon, who's the sports editor of the Post. Said, George, are you trying to dissuade the athletes from having these? I mean, why would you criticize a guy? You know, yes, you do. There are formalities you have to observe, and we've observed them all. You know, and it boggles my mind. You could criticize athletes for a lot of things, but you shouldn't criticize them for doing good things. You know, and so he decided to do his charity private, and he's donated a lot of money and to the things that he feels are worthwhile. They renamed the charity, I think, in his father's name after he'd been killed. James Jordan, who's a really fun man. I mean, his parents were great people. And if you want to know why Michael is the way he is, it's a product of his family. Comes from a very tight-knit family. Parents who never spoiled him or coddled him. Played for one of the greatest coaches ever in Dean Smith. He didn't coddle him. You know, he wasn't even probably the best player on his college team. It's probably James Worthy was.
Well, they said that the only person that could check and hold Michael Jordan down was Dean Smith.
Yeah.
What is? But first of all, David, too, I want to thank you for, you talk about charities, that you helped me with my charity. And yes, they went after me about the charity, but you helped with furnishing 2 apartments, which were for students from American University that would go over, students abroad, for the doctors and the nurses, that I had 2 apartments that I was having, and for everything else. So people don't realize that what you did too, which helped me greatly, help the people over there to make that charity very successful 24 years. Now, even though there were some circumstances that came about that weren't true, the people that we helped were helped. And that's the bottom line with everything. And just the same thing I was talking about, like with Michael, people saying, well, Michael doesn't do this or Michael doesn't do that. I told them, you don't know what Michael does. You know, sometimes you have to keep things close to the vest, just like you and everybody else, because people will inundate you, or you give them something, or you didn't give it to me.
Yeah,
you know, you don't want to get.
Curtis, I think it's more than that. It's broader. Like, you can't have other people tell you what values you should have. You know, one of the smartest guys I ever met, who gave me the best advice in this area. I tried to make a deal for Michael when he was very young, a 3-way deal. I wanted to buy a piece of the Charlotte football team. And I went to the head of the bank, Nations Bank, and I said to him, you know, I want you to pay Michael $10 million. He's going to endorse the bank, and he'll give a portion of it to Carolina, and he'll invest a portion of it with the football team. And he said to me, David, look, let me teach you a lesson. Michael makes a lot of money. I don't want to have to pay him money in order for him to give money to Carolina. And he went to Carolina. I wanted to give money to Carolina, you know, because he wants to give money to Carolina. And so you can't have people tell you what you should be doing. It's got to come from inside. And, you know, if you're that insecure that you let every person dictate what's proper, you'll never be able to take any actions. You'll be just stuck. So, you know, Michael's his own man. He's very smart, and he's made mistakes, but he's formed his own values of what he thinks he should be doing, things that interest him, places he should put his money. And no matter what he does, he's going to get criticized because he's so public, and he just got to ignore it.
Well, does that happen to you when people are coming to you because, you know, a lot of people know what you have accomplished and the kind of money that you're making? You know, do they come to you in a sense, or maybe you're not in the spotlight as much?
No, of course. I've had, you know, I'll give you again, Kermit, I'll give you a broader picture. So you know this man well, and is one of my heroes in life. But maybe the most influential man in my life was John Thompson. You know him well.
Oh, yes. Oh,
He's
yes.
one of the smartest, had the keenest sense of human nature. When I was about in my late 30s, I met John in 1980 when I was 30. So I got to know him, and he called me in one day and he said, son, can I ask you a question? I said, yes, sir. What's on your mind? He said, do you want people to like you? I said, of course. That's a very basic human instinct. He said, well, I have some advice for you. You should quit the business you're in. Because when you walk in the door and you ask a rich white owner to pay someone like Allen Iverson $100 million, that owner's going to hate your guts. And if that bothers you enough that you can't ask for the 100 million, then you're not doing your job. So quit worrying whether people like you. Your clients will love you for what you're doing. You want the people you're working with to respect you. And that was maybe one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten, because there are times that you feel a pressure to do a certain way and people push back. You've got to do what you believe in. And my job, I don't want to be disliked, but I had to learn to ignore it. You know, I listened to tons of writers that never met me ever, never talked to me, telling me I was greedy, I was arrogant, you know, and I don't, you know, they're entitled to their opinion, but if you want to have an informed opinion before you write something, so maybe you should talk to them. And I told a lot of them, you know, if you knew me at all, you know what drives me is not the money, it's not fame, it's my interior desire to please my mother, who is an amazing mentor to me, a woman of very high achievement. She had 2 master's degrees. She spoke 8 languages. She raised 3 kids, you know, while she was working with a dad who didn't provide very much. And so I always wanted to please my mother. And what I was doing, I have a sort of a compulsive drive to achieve, to try to please my mother, and has nothing to do with money or fame or publicity. And I don't have to explain that to some of these guys that aren't smart enough to understand it. But that's what drives the greatest athletes. It's not the money. You could pay Michael Jordan $1 trillion or 10 cents and he'd tear your eyes out. And I say the same with Magic or Bird, Elijah,
Kobe,
Patrick Ewing, Kobe Bryant. That's just the way it's their DNA. I like to say they're like the Terminator. They're programmed to be like the Terminator. And now there are a lot of players, and you know this, Kermit, there are a lot of players, and this is what's wrong with the rules in the NBA today. When you pay them $10, $15 million, they think they've hit the lottery. They gain 20 pounds, they don't practice. And I've heard so much, I wouldn't name this guy's name. There's a player who I think is incredibly talented and a nice guy, but I never thought had the right approach to the game mentally. And one night I was watching him play in Philly. Elton Brand, who's, you know, like my little brother, who's the GM in Philly, invited me to a game. And I was sitting with one of his good friends, who's a close friend of this particular player. I'm not going to name his name. And guy's taking terrible shots, which is typical of his game. He's a point guard. And I said, God, here he is, like 3 for 17 in the first half. And I'm just tweaking the guy because I like him. And I'm just teasing him about his. So the second half, we go into Elton's office. We watched the game. And I think the guy ended up like 6 for 21, and his team lost the game. And so the minute the game ended, the friend turns to me and said, David, F you. He goes, my guy doesn't give a flying F, you know, what you think of his game. He's making $40 million a year, and he didn't give a shit. I said, you know something, Jermaine? That's the problem. That is exactly you just identified the problem. He doesn't give a shit. Now, Michael Jordan gave a shit, and Charles, you know, Magic Johnson gave a shit. All Patrick Ewing, those guys, Alonzo Mourning, you know, Olajuwon. I mean, those guys, just the way they were, they never wanted to have a bad game. They didn't have load management back then. They did not play back. I mean, Michael Jordan probably averaged 40 minutes a game when he was 41 years old. And so I look at guys today and the amazing amounts of money they're being paid. I think the NBA is making a terrible mistake, Kermit, by putting a maximum on the star players. I think guys like in their prime, LeBron, Kobe, Curry, Giannis, Doncic right now, those guys should make at least $100 million a year. And it wouldn't cost the owners 1 penny to pay them that, because there's a hard cap. You know, there's a lot of talk right now, because collective bargaining is around the corner, that the NBA wants to hard cap. The NBA's had a hard cap for the last 25 years. The players cannot make 1 penny more than 50.1%, or they take it out of the escrow. And so what they want now is a hard cap per team. But to me, when you look at a great soccer player like Messi, you know what Messi made 2 years ago in salary?
No.
Give me a guess. What do you think he made?
His salary?
70 million?
I made a slight notion.
180. Made 180.
180 million?
a year. Right. Now, to me, if you're a guy like Kobe Bryant or LeBron or Curry, you're bringing in the fans, you're selling the jerseys, you're selling hats, you're selling hot dogs and food. You know, you are creating. Now, I'll give you an analogy if I can. I'll give you an analogy. One of my favorite actors is Denzel Washington, who I had the pleasure to meet once at a Knick game. I sat next to him. And he told me, ironically, you know this, Kermit, that he played freshman basketball at Fordham, and his backcourt mate was a guy named P.J. Carlesimo.
Okay.
Plays freshman year. I'm a huge Denzel Washington fan. I love the guy.
I love the movies, yes.
I don't care if he's in Training Day, you know, I don't care what he's in, you know.
Equalizer.
Hunt for Red Eye, you know, Crimson Tide. He's an amazing actor. He was amazing in the one where he gained a lot of weight, Roman, whatever it was called. Anyway. Now, when Denzel's in a movie, he makes $30 million a movie generally, because it's one of the premier attractions in Hollywood. He won an Academy Award. Now, if you're the number 5 actor in a movie with Denzel, you don't go to the producer and say, wait a minute, Denzel's making 30, I want to make 5, because 95% of the people in the Screen Actors Guild don't have jobs. They're working in the Cheesecake Factory bussing tables. So if you can make scale, and so Denzel creates the opportunity for those people. If you tell me that Denzel Washington's in a movie, I don't care if it's a comedy, an action movie, you know, a drama, I'm going to go. If you told me David Falk was in a movie, I'd sit home and play Scrabble or do a crossword puzzle. I wouldn't go. I don't want to go. And the truth is, and a lot of the players in the NBA don't want to understand this, 98% of the players, if you took out the top 20 players, people wouldn't go to the games.
That's true.
There's so few players, and I wouldn't say it's even 20, it's probably 10. There may be 10. And so I think those players should, I don't have any of them. I'm not saying that because they're my class. They were my clients in the day, and they did make a ton of money. But I think that today, when you artificially restrict what a guy like Giannis could make, so that the number 3 guy, whether it's Brooke Lopez or Chris Middleton, who I love, is making 30, that would never happen in the movie business, because the second guy doesn't have remotely the same impact economically. He may be a really good player, but he doesn't have the economic impact that one transcendent player has. And so I think, and the second part of it is not only they're not worth it, but most of them, when you give them that kind of money, they lose their motivation and they don't train as hard, they don't work as hard, and it's obvious to the fans. That's why it's so hard for teams to win back-to-back championships, because I think the money corrupts most players. Like it corrupts most people, except for the guys who are absolutely
the superstars, like Magic and Bird. They play to destroy you.
They play for a dollar.
You brought up a good question, because years ago, and tell me if this is true, Michael was making hundreds of millions of dollars for the NBA for licensing and everybody else. And what you just said is so true. Nobody cares about the 8th, 9th, 10th player. They don't care about them. They don't care if they don't even show up to the game. But they don't care about their jerseys or anything. Now, Michael probably was selling, what percentage of the jerseys or licensing back then?
Well, you know, I'll tell you 2 interesting things, Carm. Number one, they really didn't keep statistics then like they do now, but there's only 2 players in the history of the NBA that opted out of the group licensing program, Michael Jordan and Patrick Ewing. I had them both do it back to back in 1984 and 85. And we ended up, ironically, in a lawsuit with the NBA that Nike helped us with, because the NBA was using them in licensing, and we sued them and they had to stop. We made a settlement. But, you know, they don't allow that anymore. You know, everything that we did when we bucked the rules back in the day, they changed and said, you can't do that anymore. I mean, it's like, I'll give you the ultimate irony. So in my day, when we signed you, I'll give you a little history, Kermit, that no fan know. So there's a term in basketball called a guaranteed contract. Now, most agents don't know what a guaranteed contract means. They couldn't define it. But I'm a lawyer, and when I was very young and I wrote all the contracts, we created a contract called a no-cut guaranteed contract. And that meant two things. It literally meant that the team couldn't take the player off the roster, even if he wasn't good. They had to keep him on the roster. And they had to guarantee him his payment. And the guarantee said, quote, the obligations of the team to pay the players are absolute as of the date of signing this contract and are not dependent upon the performance or the availability of the player. That's exactly what it said. And I wrote that. Now, my first real client that I got involved with was your friend, John Lucas, in 1976.
Yes.
I
remember when he was up in your office when you were signing it. I was up there with my daughter and I think my
There you go. So John, as you know, unfortunately became the first player in NBA history to be thrown out of the league for drugs. And Houston stopped paying him, or Golden State. He'd been traded to Golden State. And I called one day and said, look, what are you doing? You have to pay this guy. I said, David, you out of your mind? We cut him. He's out of the league. I said, have you read his contract? The obligations to pay him are not dependent on his performance or his availability. A year later, we had a player named Bernard King who got arrested, in Utah, for a sexual act with a woman. And they stopped paying him. And I called him up and said, what are you doing? You can't stop paying this guy. Now, today, you can't write that. The league defines what a guaranteed contract is in the collective bargaining agreement. And so the only three sentences in the entire contract you're allowed to change are whether you have 6 payments for 12, whether you paid over 6 months to 12 months in your salary, whether you have what's called a love of the game clause that we invented for Michael Jordan to be able to play and practice off season, and whether you have the right to do local endorsements, which is called the Darnell Valentine clause, because we had an arbitration with Thornton. Other than that, you can't change anything. So when I hear someone say, I'm going to have my lawyer review the contract, if that takes more than 30 seconds, you need to get a new lawyer. They made the contract so regulated that there's no creativity left whatsoever in the contract. Cookie cutter. And so 70% of all the contracts, T.O., in the league today are not getting negotiated. They're either rookie wage scales, maximums for the superstars, mid-level exceptions, or minimums. And there's only 30% that negotiate. So, the role of the agent has dramatically changed in the last 10 or 15 years. It's been really narrowed down. There's very little negotiation left. And, in my last year, the last year before we had the wage scale, which was 1994, we represented the 5th pick of the draft, who was Juwan Howard. And the 3rd pick of the draft was Grant Hill. I love Grant Hill. He's the one player in the history of the NBA that sort of got away. And he knows, I feel like a jilted lover. I admire him. I respect him. He's a class act through and through. I'm a big Cowboys fan. I love his dad, Calvin. But, his mom, who passed recently, she's a very intelligent woman. She felt that he shouldn't have to pay a percentage of his contract. He should do it by the hour. So after 9 years of the league, he made the All-Star team 6 times, and Juwan Howard made the All-Star team 1 time, and Juwan earned Grant by $47 million over his first $5 million a year. That was 70% of what Grant made. So his fee wasn't hourly. It ended up being 70%. And so you can't do that anymore. You can't. And that's a frustration being in the business. It'd be like, if I give you a basketball analogy, it'd be like if the competition committee this summer passed a rule that said no player can score more than 12 points a game. It's like fouling out. It's like getting 6 fouls. Once you have 12 points, you have to sit down. Okay, so a guy like Curry, he'd score 12 points in the first 3 minutes. He could take a shower, go to the movies, and come back and be in the locker room and the game is over. Now, some guy on his team, let's say Looney, he's going to average 40 minutes a game, and he's going to score 12 points. So at the end of the season, Looney sits down with Curry, and Curry says, so, how'd you do this year? He said, I averaged 12 points. And Curry said, yeah, me too. He said, well, I guess we're the same kind of player because we both have the same statistics. That's what's happened in my business. Guys who couldn't understand the difference between a guarantee and a no cut are in the same business I'm in, but the rules protect them from not knowing the nuances of the business, which is what creates the business. So again, not bitter about it, but there's very little challenge being an agent in today's NBA.
Okay, so that was part one of our interview with David Falk. We'll be back